There are indubitably many naysayers in the world with respect to the manosphere. And sometimes this naysaying is somewhat justified, I have to say, inasmuch as there's a lot of hyperbole and a fair bit of inaccuracy in the manosphere, and a lot of it's done just to produce a certain effect rather than to get the truth across. And as a consequence, a lot of normies, the mainstream, normal folks in general, are very willing and ready to dismiss certain claims made in the manosphere. One of the things that they most readily dismiss, that's become apparent to me over the many years, is the notion that things have gotten bad for men, in a general sense, specifically with respect to certain types of dangerous social situations. For example, various types of conflict that can emerge in the workplace or the work environment due to interactions between men and women, where some kind of interaction might be interpreted incorrectly and there is a false allegation, this sort of thing. Or alternatively, that a woman might be displeased with a man and as a consequence might make some type of false allegation directed towards him. And these things, of course, do happen. But normies and naysayers will, of course, say these types of cases are so vanishingly rare that you might as well just discount them. So basically the claim is that men in the manosphere and men more broadly are unjustifiably in a state of paranoia. They're being paranoid about this sort of thing, and it's all just poppycock and bollocks. Well, I don't think that's the case. And today I want to talk about several things, but I want to talk about whether or not men are in fact paranoid, in particular when you can observe certain things. And the item on the agenda today is something that flew under a lot of people's radar, namely actual rules, laws in place in the UK, in the London Tube, i.e. the subway, in the London Tube, that prevent you from, quote-unquote, staring at people. We all know this means women. Now, this came into effect last year, and I will be reading this brief article to illustrate what this does. Staring can land you in prison as police crack down on, quote-unquote, unhealthy sexual behavior. A senior police officer has urged everyone who witnesses, quote-unquote, intense staring on the London Underground to report it amid concerns it could be an early sign of unhealthy sexual behavior. Detective Inspector Sarah White, who leads British Transport Police Sexual Offences Team, said her officers are receiving daily reports of people committing sexual offences, including staring. Last month, Transport for London launched a new campaign aimed at tackling sexual harassment of women and girls, which included upskirting, catcalling, and staring. Posters now have been in place in tube stations across the capital stating, "Intrusive staring of a sexual nature is sexual harassment and is not tolerated." On Sunday, Detective Superintendent Sarah White, a senior British Transport Police officer, told The Telegraph it's human nature to stare at things. However, it's very different when someone is staring, leering, or there's a sexual motivation. We want to know about that staring because that is the behavior that suggests to me that someone is thinking about a sexual behavior that supports that staring. We will record them as crimes and we will investigate them. And we have had successful prosecutions in that field. Just last month, a man was sentenced to 22 weeks in prison after a woman reported him for, quote-unquote, continuously staring at her on a train in Berkshire. Dominic Bullock, 26 of Spurcraft Road, Thatcham, was found guilty of causing intentional harassment, alarm, or distress after he sat next to the victim on the train and began staring at her very intensely. The victim asked Bullock to stop staring several times as it was making her feel uncomfortable. BTP Sergeant Charlotte Collins said at the time of his sentencing that it was clear from Bullock's persistent and distressing actions that he is a danger to women and girls. A Centre for London survey from 2019 found that women were nearly twice as likely as men to mention personal safety as a barrier to walking and using public transport. Research also shows that nearly half of those who experience sexual harassment do not tell anyone. In a statement released at the start of the anti-harassment campaign, TfL said sexual harassment is a form of violence most often directed against women and girls in public places. The safety of women and girls is an absolute priority for TfL, and this new campaign is one element of TfL's work to ensure everyone can travel with confidence. The campaign aims to challenge the normalization and dismissal of this behavior as something that happens to women and girls on public transport and in other public places, making it clear that it is never acceptable and that the strongest possible action will always be taken. Okay, so that's the article, and that's what's going down there. And for the record, I don't approve of harassing people, intensely staring at them, whether they're men or women. Obviously, if you're doing this in a menacing, intentional way, you shouldn't be doing this to anyone, whether male or female. Of course, they never say that. They always specify female. But this idea, for example, that men are simply paranoid, because I want to enjoin you to think about the possibility, the very easy possibility of abusing something like this. So I have a friend who very easily gets lost in thought, and he ends up staring in some random direction. But the reality is he's not staring at anything specific. So it might seem like he's staring at you personally, or a tree or a rock, but in reality he's preoccupied with something else. His mind is elsewhere, but he's not actually staring. He's not focused on anything or anyone. Now imagine him being in London Tube, and he's lost in thought, thinking about, I don't know, Elder Scrolls 6 and when it might release, and he ends up, quote-unquote, staring at some woman, even though he's not really staring at her. It seems that way. He could get into serious trouble, indeed even face jail time. Now again, I do not approve or condone menacingly staring at people, whether they're men or women, anywhere, if it's done with a hostile intention. But the point here is that this can be very easily misinterpreted. And we all know creep syndrome, as I've come to call it. This idea that a male who's not desirable or is unattractive or otherwise is quote-unquote creepy looks at a female and she reports it as a type of harassment because she doesn't like the way he looks, versus the equivalent of a Brad Pitt or some other Chad looking at her. That's very dangerous. Another one, this is an actual anecdote from a gym that I've heard, was the example of a blind man who was accused of staring at a woman. Well, shockingly, he had no idea what he was staring at because the guy was blind, and she brought over the management of the gym to somehow get him in hot water when it was manifestly the case that he was blind. So there's a lot of room for abuse here with something like this. Another unrelated example was a story I heard from a guy I talk to sometimes online, who's a very big guy, 6'6", overweight, smokes, fair enough, has a kind of menacing aura, you could argue. But in his city, there is a municipal law, which is to say a local law, that prevents lone men from being in the park where children tend to play by himself. So what happened? He was coming back from work, sat down on a bench, lit up a cigarette because he was tired, was sitting there, and the police were called to remove him from the park because in his city there's a municipal law that states that he's not allowed to be there. It is actually illegal in his city to be there in this context because he's a big menacing dude, or more accurately put, he has a penis. So, the question here, again, is it simply paranoia? Are men just paranoid, or are things being implemented that are actively hostile to men and men's well-being? Well, I think it's pretty obvious that when you have massive government or municipal intrusion into your life that prevents you from doing things that could lead to behaviors being completely misinterpreted when they're absolutely harmless, you're in real hot water. Now, sure, are there ways around that? Yeah. Maybe in this guy's city, he just shouldn't sit on park benches because he's not allowed to. And I've lived in London before. If I were riding the tube, I would just do what I learned back in the day in New York City. You stare at the floor, you don't make eye contact with anyone. And that was for completely different reasons, so as to not make eye contact with hooligans and thugs. That said, that's not necessarily a way to live. And this obsession we have, which is frankly speaking, yes, gynocentric, with elevating women, lionizing their behavior and their concerns, and dismissing male concerns, is rampant. When you have an entire city, the capital city of the UK, implement a policy like this, sure, yes, the one guy they mentioned clearly was in the wrong. And again, I'll say it for the last time, I do not approve of menacingly staring at people, whether they're men or women or anybody. But this could easily go awry and be misinterpreted. But all of this begs a question. Why is this happening? Why is there so much anti-male sentiment? I think we've proven now that there is anti-male sentiment. Despite the claims of normies to the contrary, yes, men aren't just paranoid. Well, I have a theory. I cannot prove this definitively. It's based on observation after years, if not decades. But what I think has happened here, gentlemen, is the following. I think these types of political and legal moves have emerged lockstep with the decommissioning, as it were, of men as a whole, which is to say, men have become, at least in the perception of the public, and specifically women, less and less useful. So we're looking at the concept of male utility here. It has, whether it's accurate or not, in the perception of the public, and very specifically women, noticeably decreased in recent years, slowly over the previous decades, as the technology has amassed that has allowed for this partial delusion that men are simply not useful anymore, even though men are clearly absolutely required to run society and to maintain civilization to keep it running. The perception is, masked, as I said, by this veil of technology, that men are just not useful anymore. We see it in the dating and mating arena, right? Lookism is more important than ever. Why? Because the other things that men could potentially add to the equation are not as important, or at least not perceived to be as important as they used to be. So, as men become less useful, even though that's technically probably not true, but we're talking about perception here, as men become less useful, so too does the way we treat and interact with men change, almost invariably for the worst. Conversely, in a society that valued men's accomplishments, their contributions, and the things that they do in general, i.e. their utility, you're very unlikely to see laws, rules, and regulations specifically targeting men in general as a group. Yeah, you had things targeting specific types of men based on ethnicity, maybe, class, whatever, but never before has there been a wholesale, broad brush attempt to basically get men into hot water, oftentimes simply for existing. Again, this instance from the London Tube, to my mind, can easily be abused. False allegations do happen, and they are permanent damage even if you are exonerated from all blame and shown to be completely innocent. So, as men become less and less useful in the eyes of the public, and by that, of course, I mean women, so too do the laws, rules, and regulations become more draconian with respect to men specifically as a group. Because at the end of the day, what is a man who is not useful? Because it all goes back to this very simple equation of reproduction. Women are reproductively valuable, men are not. On the individual level, at the group level. All of our instincts about the value of women and the lack of value of men are informed by this and have been for countless millennia and far longer. So when the nominal utility of men seems to have disappeared, what do you do about them? Well, you do your best to ignore them, but when you can't ignore them, when they just, for whatever reason, get in the way of something, I'm using this in scare quotes, obviously, then you do something about them. You get rid of them. You make life difficult for them. Because men, in the eyes of women, are a pain to deal with. They are useless, right? Which is why you have draconian laws on the books, like this instance on the London Underground. The mating and dating market, right? It's more about looks now than it ever has been before. For a variety of reasons. I've talked about this ad nauseum across dozens of videos, but you know the reasons. The same reason we have gender-specific legislation and laws and rules that are meant to discourage types of behavior that are seen as harmful, and sometimes they are. Again, the very last time, I don't think anyone in his right mind approves of menacingly staring at a person, whether male or female. But this can easily be misinterpreted. It is very, very liable to be misinterpreted and used against men who are simply too creepy because they're not attractive enough, because they spent a second or two looking at somebody. That sort of thing is not out of the question. And the less useful men become over time, the more we're going to see these types of things. This is my theory. I cannot prove it definitively, but I think it's very likely true. Another element to this is the different evolved psychology. The article mentions, of course, that women are more concerned about their security than men are. Of course they are. Women worry more about their own security. They're more neurotic. They worry about these things. But with the exception of the R word, right, men in every conceivable category are more likely to suffer grievous injury or even death. murder, assault, robbery, men should technically be, looking at it statistically, more worried about their safety than women. But they're not, because of a difference in psychology. And what's happened, effectively now, is that women's psychological concerns have become writ large in our public consciousness, and they are now being wedded directly to the law, to rules and regulations, whether or not they are accurate in their perceptions or not. Now, I'm not trying to dismiss all of women's concerns, but the reality is, with the exception of the R word, which, yes, for women is a terrifying prospect, every other form of violent encounter is more likely to happen to a man. And this is something that can very easily veer into a feelings over facts situation, as we simply listen to sentiment, emotion, and concerns that are predicated on evolved psychology and less so on the reality on the ground, which is, in a way, what we're seeing happening with this London business and many other things. The baseline assumption that men are harmful and dangerous, all men, and even people in the know, even people who know better or should know better at the very least, like the godfather of evolutionary psychology, David Buss, who wrote a book titled When Men Behave Badly, The Hidden Roots of Sexual Deception, Harassment, and Assault. Obviously, it's a sensationalist title. Obviously, it's not meant to be entirely accurate. And in the book itself, he concedes that the number of men and the type of men who commit these types of crimes and perpetrate these things is a small minority, and it's always the same men again and again. It's not all men. It's a small minority that do these things repeatedly. Would you be led to that conclusion based on the title of his book? Again, the godfather of evolutionary psychology, one of the OGs, with his sensationalist title. God forbid you were ever to write a book titled When Women Behave Badly, The Hidden Roots of Manipulation, Lying, and blah, blah, blah. You could never write that book. You would be excoriated in the public sphere, and you'd lose all opportunity for employment and probably your livelihood. So even for an evolutionary psychologist like David Buss, bashing men pays off. It's well worth the effort. So we'll call this the theory of inverse utility. I've coined this just now, the theory of inverse utility. As the utility of men goes down, so too does the poor treatment of men go up. That's basically how it works. That's what I've been observing. And I think I'm onto something. And I think this will continue to get worse because we're not heading into a world where men are becoming more and more useful. Quite the opposite. Men are, in the eyes of the many, specifically women, more useless than ever. All these types of laws we can observe, these new forms of rules and regulations, they will get worse and worse and worse. Normies or milquetoast commentators are aware of this. They're observing that these things are a little bit absurd, right? The strange laws on the book, the rules and regulations, you can't sit on a park bench in certain cities, whatever. They also know that therapy, for example, as an institution, is overwhelmingly an institution that caters to females and female psychology. Now, no one in the mainstream, or even mainstream adjacent, is willing to say that there's a problem here because they all have to ennoble everything that is happening with respect to supporting women, boosting women, and elevating them in every regard. They can never say that something might be negative with respect to women. So it's always prefaced by something like, feminism was absolutely necessary, feminism is great, we absolutely need to support women and girls in every endeavor and everything they do, regardless of what they want, regardless of what they do, but it seems slowly but surely there's a bit of a problem for men, really small one maybe, but it's a bit of a problem, maybe someone will address it. So you have about 10 minutes of praising women and how amazing they are and how much they need help and support and how we need to continue to do so. And then maybe men and boys aren't doing so well. Maybe we shouldn't have rules on the book that discriminate wholesale against men. Maybe we shouldn't do that. But it's really important we support women and encourage everything they do, whether or not it is positive or negative. And if it's negative, most of the time you're not even allowed to mention it. So even the people with influence and reach, people that normies listen to, don't have the balls or the inclination to say anything about this. They will preface everything with, look, just because we want to support men and boys doesn't mean that we want to take away support from women. Now, I'm not saying this is necessarily a zero-sum game, but the reality is, let's be perfectly frank and honest here, we live in a world of limited resources, right? We have to partition these resources. It can be, absolutely can be the case that, random example here, educational resources can overwhelmingly be partitioned such that women get the lion's share and men get almost nothing. Women can, for example, get most of the money, most of the resources that are invested in social aid, social services, right? And men can get a pittance or next to nothing. Look at the homeless shelter situation. Look at the domestic abuse situation. Yes, it is not a zero-sum game, but oftentimes, very often in fact, resources and their allocation are divvied up and women get the majority. And that is why, and this is one of the honest aspects of some of these feminists and normies out there, they are worried that if you support men or boys, you will take something away from women. Because we live in a world of limited resources, whether it's social capital, whether it's actual physical resources, whether it's money, whatever it is, when you take something away, you can only give so much to one side of the equation. And we would rather give almost everything to women and almost nothing to quote-unquote useless men, because that's what makes women happy, and that is what is politically acceptable, expedient, and perceived at the very least to be the most beneficial to society at large. And I can assure you that every effort to support men or boys in any respect will be countered by, oh, you're against women and girls, you're against supporting women and girls, you want to take away X, because no one wants to have that honest conversation that we do not live in a world of unlimited resources. And yes, to some degree, even though it's not a zero-sum game, to some degree, when you support one side, you automatically contribute to the losing out of the other side. Whether you want to admit it or not, that's just part of reality. And our reality as men is that we will collectively lose out. That's just the way it is. Sperm are cheap, eggs are expensive, and that is how our society is designed now. Men are perceived no longer to be useful, so men might as well go the way of the dodo. Anyway, that's it for today. A very special thanks to my patrons and my donors. You guys are incredible, and I am deeply appreciative of the support you have for the channel. Otherwise, as usual, please leave a like, share, comment, subscribe. Maybe the algorithm won't hate me this time. And if I'm still alive, I will check you out later. May the gods watch over you. Take care. All the best. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.